Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Dan Borscher, coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people. Coming up, interest rates on hold as renters fight back against price hikes and negligent landlords. Why Australians are paying more for childcare and what governments can do about it. And 90s television star Pamela Anderson steps out makeup free, why some are calling it a rebellion. Joining me on the panel, journalist MARC, FENNELL. Great to have you back. Podcasts, stories, TV, docos, it's all happening for you at the moment.
And now I have a whole desk myself. It's nice to be. Thank you for having me.
Oh, we're so far away from each other. We'll get into the yarn shortly. In Canberra, demographer at the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods, Liz Allen. Wonderful to have you back.
It's good to be back.
In Brisbane, former State Director of the Victorian National Party and Crisis Management Consultant, Sally Branson. Wonderful to see you again. Thanks for joining us.
Dan, you too. Lovely to be here.
And in Perth, lecturer at the University of Western Australia, AURORA MILROY, who I've read and watched about for many years, but I'm just getting to meet you. G'day, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dan.
And you can join us online using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we live stream on Facebook as well. First to the cost of living crisis, and there was another reprieve for mortgage borrowers today. As the Reserve Bank's first monetary policy meeting under new Governor Michelle Bullock, the board decided to leave interest rates on hold for the fourth straight month. However, the RBA says inflation remains too high and hasn't ruled out more interest rate hikes. Senior ANZ economist Adelaide Timbrell says despite today's pause, homeowners should expect rates to remain higher for longer.
So there's two things you can do. You can hike, then cut, or you can hike a little less, but keep that tightened rate on for longer. That means that people, they're not at the height of financial stress compared to perhaps other cash rates in other economies, but they have to handle that peak for a lot longer than those other economies do. ANZ research expects that we'll see no rate cuts until around November 2024. We've got a long way to go before inflation is close enough to target that the Reserve Bank can start unwinding the restrictive territory that they've put in place in order to get inflation down. There will be pain, whether it's lifestyle downgrades for some or real true financial stress for others. But overall, the average household in Australia is well placed to kind of muddle through. And what's really good is that the unemployment rate's relatively low and it will stay low through the cycle. So yes, everything's getting more expensive, interest rates are high, inflation is high, things are getting expensive quickly, but most people will have a job and continue to have a job throughout this painful period. Whereas in other periods of economic downturn, a lot of people have lost their job, which of course adds a massive extra financial pressure.
Well, Liz, everything is expensive, getting more expensive, but at least we have a job. I wonder what your reaction was today to the Reserve Bank and also to that comment that we could possibly be seeing those interest rates staying higher for longer.
I think I've entered this kind of period of kind of grief where I've just got to this kind of despondent phase. It's like this kind of feeling of pain. It's like, oh, you know, we've been here before, we've done it before. It's just this another cycle of pain. It doesn't feel like it's ever going to end. I think the only thing that I take any kind of hope from is that we've got to the point now where this pain is now mainstream, which is, I'm not taking any kind of joy out of it whatsoever. But because it's mainstream now, it means that people are paying attention to it. And so we're seeing inequality now in such a mainstream manner that we're getting traction, which says a lot, right? That inequality is now mainstream and that we're talking about this on the news, on the TV every day. We're talking about economic pain and we're talking about a new crisis that it is now at the point where we're fatigued by talking about this stuff. I'm getting to the point now, though, where I'm just thinking, when are we actually going to see some substantive action? And I don't think I'm alone in this. And I don't see anything on the horizon that in a meaningful way will see any change anytime soon. And I think that, it's all well and good to say, okay, we've all got a job, or more of us has a job, and we're going to weather the storm well together. I don't think people see that, and cost of living is at the forefront of people's minds, and that's going to have a long-term impact on people's well-being.
Well, and Mark, is it when that inequality that Liz was talking about is at front of mind and politicians are seeing and hearing the reaction to that every day, is that when we see the traction and things start to change?
Gee, you'd want to hope so, wouldn't you? I mean,
I reckon many Australians will be wanting to hope so.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly take Liz's point that there is a sense now that it is mainstream. I feel the same way, Liz. Like we're talking about it more. You know, cost of living is not an economic concept, it's a lived concept, right? And it's one that people are seeing play out with their neighbours and their friends and their family and their own personal decisions. What you would hope would come from that is a greater, I guess, compassion and empathy for inequality that exists either side of this environment that we're in right now. Will we actually see it? My suspicion, and I'm a little bit cynical by nature, is that we probably won't. That as soon as the economic circumstances change and it isn't an everyday construct that people talk about, people will kind of go back to their behaviour, and therefore the political pressure on government to do something about it will disappear. I would love to be wrong, though. I'd really love to be wrong about that.
Yeah, well, I wonder, lots of nods and agreement there that maybe things won't change. Aurora, you recently bought a home in Perth. Did the discussion and the impacts of interest rates have any bearing on that decision that you made?
Well, for a start, I was sort of in an incredibly privileged position to even consider buying a home, and partly that was because I'd spent a year, due to COVID, I moved from Melbourne and I was living with my mum rent-free for a year. I was also making bank in the job I was in at the time. And so that's kind of the only thing that could make it a possibility, right? But when I was looking at rentals, the kind of value for money wasn't looking great. And at that point, the interest that I would be paying on my home loan was about equivalent to what I'd be paying in a rental, which felt like dead money, I guess. And so, yeah, kind of, I decided to buy because I could and I really wanted that stability. But I did sort of delude myself about how much interest rates would rise. And I'm yet to see a month in which my outgoings are less than my incomings. At the moment, it continues a year after buying to be higher. But the whole point is I'm actually incredibly privileged in the position I am to have savings, to be able to have higher outgoings and continue my luxurious lifestyle. And also to be able to choose to buy. Obviously, we think about this interest rate rises, which seem like a really blunt instrument to me to sort of deal with this issue, and actually they just kind of accentuate the gap in and inequality, really, because they're not affecting the people at the top who have multiple properties. It's really the sort of young families, new homeowners, and also renters who don't even get the choice for a more stable environment and have a real power shift with landlords. That are suffering the most, and we pretend that this is what's going to curb kind of rising inflation, but actually cost of living pressures and the kind of role of the rate rises are affecting people differentially.
Yeah, and those compounding impacts, Sally, we often hear people saying things are tough and we're having to tighten the belt. But there comes a point, and I'm sure you're hearing it like I am, where you can't tighten anymore. There are no more cuts to be made. Then what happens? I mean, is that where we are at now?
Well, for many families, I think that is the case, and we're seeing that people are under greater mortgage stress than ever before, rental stress than ever before. I'm in the Gold Coast now, but was in Victoria, in regional Victoria. But in the Gold Coast, there are suburbs where the statistics are that rent has gone up some extraordinary amount. Some people are paying, I know our own rent, we've been there for 3 years and we've had a significant price increase every year, where it is at that stage where you think, why are we paying rent when we could be, why are we battling to pay rent when we could be battling to pay a mortgage? But people are seeing it. We've got an e-commerce business as well, and all of the groups that I'm in are talking about how squeezy things are, that people aren't buying anything that isn't a necessity, that people are going to Coles and doing school lunches with, you know, that you can buy packs of 24 lamingtons for $2. So of course that's what people are putting in their lunchboxes. But for some people, they can't even afford to make the lunchboxes. So that's where we're seeing more social services and support, and organisations like the Victorian Consumer Action Group are saying that they're seeing more people coming to them with more mortgage stress than they've ever seen before. So what happens when people are so squeezed that they can't pay their bills is that we're seeing that full effect on the economy. But it's interesting because we say, what are the other options? How do we decrease spending in other ways? And it is a blunt tool, but is it the only tool that we've got?
And it's not the only tool that we've got. And you've hit the nail on the head here, that interest rates are an extremely blunt tool. They're also quick and dirty, right? And so there's been a lot written, particularly in the ABC, by the ABC journos in the last couple of months, where interest rates have been proven time and time again as that kind of quick and dirty lever to pull to kind of level things out in the economy. There are other ways that we can adjust, but they take longer to see impact. And I think that Australia can be very proud in taking the label, and we all need to wear a pin on that one that says kind of, we like the quick and dirty. We're good at that, right? We've got to the...
Quick and dirty was the word I heard most often in politics. Quick and dirty. Quick and dirty.
We like the quick and dirty because we keep kicking the can down the road, and we've got to the point of crisis point, right, where we don't have the time. We don't have the time to do the proper thing, that we now have to do the quick and dirty. And we get to the point of crisis. We don't have the time. Let's get to the point now where we think more strategically, where we can buy ourselves some time so we're not doing the quick and dirty.
But can we ever do that in an election cycle?
Well,
that is the issue, isn't it?
No.
And there's so many of those issues compound, and one of those is
Exactly.
renting that we were just hearing about. And the tight housing market has also pushed rents sky high around the country, with little power for tenants to challenge rent hikes or insist that their homes are actually properly maintained. One rental advocate is trying to change that. Melbourne lawyer Geordie Vandenberg runs the website Shit Rentals, where renters can name and shame dodgy properties and negligent agents. He spoke to the Drum's Michael Forno.
Asbestos, black mould, and dodgy plumbing.
That's the shower drain.
These are but a few of the issues Blake Hesketh had to contend with during his 7-year tenancy here in Melbourne's West.
We only really started paying attention to the last owners took over, and that's when the house would progressively got into a state where we're like, you need to look after your investment.
When it came to repairs, successive real estate agents dragged their feet.
Sprouts were growing out of the carpet, and yeah, that's when it got a bit too rich. By that time, like, plumbing was still leaking into the carpet. That's when we found out about the gas leak as well, and heaps of other things that were way too dodgy.
Exasperated at the situation, Blake reached out to rental advocate and reviewer Geordie Vandenberg, known online as Purple Pingers.
Hello, welcome back to Shit Rentals.
He's used his online profile to give voice to renters and recently launched shitrentals.org, a searchable database of reviews from tenants.
It exists to kind of redress some of the power imbalances that exist in as a renter.
Renters can upload their stories and photos, which are all verified by Geordie himself.
Check this out.
When you apply for a rental property, you have so much, like you have to give the real estate agent and the landlord so much information about yourself. You can't ask the landlord for references, otherwise you'll be laughed out of a house.
To date, more than 1,000 reviews have been posted online. Among the common grievances are structural defects, unresponsive or invasive real estate agents, and the dreaded recurrent black mould.
If you love living in a mould-infested house where the landlord just turns up whenever he feels, this is the place for you.
Landlord refused to fix the faulty wiring in the house despite multiple trades stating it was non-compliant. Tradesmen stated it would cause a fire. Death trap house.
The Drum sought comment from numerous bodies representing the industry. All either declined to comment or failed to respond at all.
there's been some people who are not happy with it, but I think it's because no one likes being called out. But, you know, you've been not being able to be called out for so long, and it's time for that to change.
Mark.
I love what Geordie does.
That is intense. That carpet was squishy.
Yeah, and his channel is ridiculous, and it's like the stuff of nightmares. But also, it's a reminder. Like I've been a renter and I've been a homeowner, and one of the reasons why we ended up buying ours, and we were lucky to do so at the time, is simply because we kept on getting kicked out of rental places, and the way in which renters are treated in this country, compared to other countries, I should point out, is atrocious, right? And I think. Yeah, we were talking about affordability and cost of living earlier, and I do think that one of the issues we have in Australia is that we've created this sort of power imbalance where renters are treated so atrociously, particularly in the major cities, that there's very little recourse other than a TikTok account, and a very good one, I should say. So I think, you know, we want to talk about structural issues. I mean, you compare the way renters operate here versus the way renters can operate in certainly even places like the US or the UK. The rights and kind of recourses are really, really drastically out of whack. And I don't think we can deal with issues of housing affordability, and I don't think we can deal with issues of what we do with our money more broadly until we deal with that component of the market.
Yeah. Liz, there's something in what Mark was just talking about, isn't there, about that imbalance and the lack of rights for renters. Is this the way to go, or is it actually about law reform that evens the playing field?
Without a doubt, there needs to be law reform. So I think what's so extraordinary about what Geordie is doing is that we've got to the year 2023 and renting is not new. Again, it's this idea that when inequality becomes mainstream, it's when it gets attention. It takes a crisis for this country to pay attention. This is not new. Rentals have been, and I'm going to use the phrase in that way it gets to air, shit rentals has been a thing in Australia since forever. And it's not until we see shit rentals go mainstream that we see people care about it. That's how extraordinary this inequality problem is in Australia. And it takes a lone person to say, hang on a second, this issue is so big that I'm going to do it by myself. I'm going to crowd do this thing without any kind of commercial funding or commercial interest, because it is the right thing to do. I think that's extraordinary. If we look at the rights and the responsibilities of renters and landlords and so on, the scales are in the favour of the landlords and the real estate agents. We can look at tenancy agreements and so on. You've got to look at it. If we look at the kind of blacklisting and so on of renters, renters will get blacklisted, and without even knowing they're being blacklisted for frivolous things, to be honest, it happens, and it's ridiculous. We're not seeing the same thing happen, the same kind of recourse occurring for landlords and for real estate agents, and we know that the law is not being adhered to. Why are we not seeing the same sorts of protections for renters? And it comes back to this unfair power imbalance.
Yeah.
We must see law changes.
Yeah, and a balance of that rights and responsibilities. We are going to have to move on. How does the thought to you of a basement full of thousands of human skulls sit? I know, that's how I feel too. Well, for our panellist, Mark FENNELL, he quite literally found out. The Morton Cranial Collection is housed at a University of Pennsylvania museum in the United States. Mark's new podcast, House of Skulls, looks at how ethnologist Samuel George Morton, known to many as the father of craniology, came to create this collection. And in doing so, it looks deeper at that relationship between science, doesn't it, Mark? What is it about these stories that drew you in?
Why am I weird? Is that what you want to say? Why is Mark weird? All right,
interpret that however you want.
Look, I'll tell you how it started. I happened to be talking to a retired priest, because my job is weird and these things happen. And he casually mentioned to me that he got his phone call from America, and they said, "Hey, we've got the skull of a Catholic parishioner. He's a cannibal. What do you want us to do with it?" And he said it so casually that I was a bit like, "Sorry, what?" And as soon as he's like, "Oh yeah, there's an entire classroom in the University of Pennsylvania that's wall-to-wall human skulls from around the world." And I'm like, "Say what now?" And as soon as I got off the phone with him, I immediately got sucked into this vortex of why was this thing put together? Who would put it together? And actually what I think the most interesting thing, because initially I thought, okay, so, you know, we'll tell the story of the skulls and work out how they got there. But actually what's more interesting is why. This guy, Samuel Morton, was a believer that you and I and everybody on the panel and everybody watching, we're actually not one race. We're multiple different races. And he was trying to prove a sort of taxonomy that white men had the biggest brains, therefore were meant to lead, Africans were at the bottom, and all of the rest of us were sort of somewhere in the middle. And that's what he was setting out to do. And in order to prove that, he needed a data set, and this is why he collects the skulls. He ends up getting them dug up from burial grounds. The biggest cohort is Native American skulls, and yet the way I found out about it was this Irish cannibal from Tasmania.
And we'll get to him in a moment, but I want you to tell me about the two-day symposium at the university, the media release that led to that, and what happened then.
So the thing that I found most surprising is that the Morton Cranial Collection was not a secret. They weren't hiding it. It was there. People who went to the university, and this is one of the most prestigious Ivy League universities in America. It's a very well-known university. And students passed through knew about it. But at a certain point, they started to organise a symposium where students and staff were organising a symposium to talk about where it came from. And that's when local activists went there for the first time, and a handful of them heard about it for the very first time, and that's really when things blew up. This is 2019, and suddenly the entire community around them is aware that this thing exists, and they're the ones who go, same reaction I had, I'm sorry, what? Why is this a thing? And from there, the Morton Cranial Collection, the University of Pennsylvania, has never been the same. They have this sort of hand grenade that they're sitting on of why that they put it there and how it's so linked to a history of race and a history of violence that kind of permeates the culture of the university.
Yeah, and the series doesn't shy away from uncomfortable parts of our history, as you've been touching on. In fact, episode 2, called The Cannibals, begins with Australia's most notorious Catholic parishioner, Alexander Pierce, who wasn't just an escaped convict, but also a cannibal. His skull ended up in Morton's collection, and he was labelled the European cannibal. Why? Well, because in the 19th century, cannibalism was seen as something that non-Europeans did, or people that weren't white. A racial assumption that was created by explorer Christopher Columbus, as Mark explained.
There was a problem. His boss, Queen Isabella, back in Spain, she didn't want to enslave anyone who she thought could be converted to Christianity. So he needed to prove that they were all beyond salvation. Now, Columbus had written in his journals about certain tribes he'd encountered who ate people. It should be said alongside notes of mermaids and dog-faced humans. But for these tribes, he coined a term, cannibals. By coining that word, cannibal, Columbus helped enslave thousands of people. But he also planted a seed about black and brown people that has taken root across generations of white people.
This episode and the scientific background was particularly chilling. There's a term that you used when you were talking about Alexander Pierce and how he was viewed by the scientific community at the time as, quote, the exceptions that reveal a rule. Step me through what he's actually saying here.
I think the reason why Morton and so many other doctors and scientists of the time were obsessed with Alexander Pierce. His head becomes a celebrity after his death. People talk about it. People share stories about it. And one of the reasons is because no one can believe that a white man, albeit an Irish man, can be a cannibal, right? No one can believe this idea. And so that's why it becomes so interesting to doctors and science and men of American science at the time, because this idea that cannibalism was purely something that black and brown people do had so permeated culture. And it is worth pointing out that there is obviously a history of cannibalism in certain cultures. There's no question that it is. But nothing on the scale that Christopher Columbus sold. And with that idea, he legitimised dispossession of Indigenous land. He legitimised huge chunks of slavery as well. And so a big part of what the series is about is going, okay, so on the one hand, you've got this very strange collection, very weird, but it's about working out where the tendrils actually reach, and it reaches to some bizarre places. I mean, we do a story in the series about an NFL player who struggled to get a payout from the NFL for concussions because black players have to prove greater cognitive damage than white players, and you follow the roots of that, and they go back to exactly. And the Morton Cranial Collection was considered hugely influential for doctors in the South of America. The lawyers in the South actually thanked him for permeating this idea that cognitively African Americans are lower than white people. That helped them justify slavery at a time where slavery was up for debate. So it's about, I think, the strange thing that I've found myself doing over the years is things that sit in museums and galleries, they are not static. Right? They tell a story and they have an impact that ripples out to us in the present. And I think when I had that initial conversation with that priest, I don't think I could have predicted just how far the ripples from this collection went. And they have skulls from all over the world. Literally, like, if you're watching this now, there's a skull from probably where you are. It's incredible how far the history reaches around the world.
It's extraordinary. Aurora, I want to bring you in. You're in the world of academic research. You're also from the Balgu people of East Pilbara. When you were hearing and listening to that and those ripples of the effects of it, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, I think, I talk a lot about museums and galleries and the culture of that. These are really key colonial institutions. And as you say, this kind of has such a broad-ranging effect and something that we still see today. So, as you said, a lot of what we kind of consider science and consider as kind of policy or other influences on our current day-to-day, they're all founded in these kind of colonial notions and eugenicist notions. Here in Western Australia, we had quite a famous eugenicist of A.O. Neville, or he was very fond of the kind of ideas of eugenics, and he was the chief protector of Aboriginal people and perpetuated a lot of the kind of stolen generations policies that we saw in Western Australia. So we see a lot of negative impacts of these ideas that are wrapped up and presented as a form of science, but are really a racial politic and are inextricably linked with the process of colonisation. And we also see these people get recognised in institutions as well. So for instance, Melbourne University, the students protested the recognition of Richard Berry, who was a famous eugenicist, on one of the buildings there, and thinking about the legacy of these people and the way that they've excluded people like myself and others from these institutions and dressed up their own ideas as a form of science. And I think in looking at how colonial kind of institutions overseas have collected and taken Indigenous and other people's remains to perpetuate these racial ideologies, we also have to remember that a lot of the institutions here in Australia, universities and museums, have got Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander human remains as well.
Sally, there's another layer to this, isn't there? And that is around the ethics and the way right now there are impacts from that research and those conversations that were done back then. Is that's something that we are grappling with, isn't it?
And I think we have been over the last few decades, and I think it started with things like the Elgin marbles and where they belong and where they should be. But when we talk about things like human remains, in 2023, there is no reason with digital technology why there should be human remains that aren't repatriated or where they belong. So there is a real ethics argument to that piece, but I can't say it any better than the previous panellists, but it is something that has affected us deeply because museums and universities are the places of revered cultural knowledge that when we see something in an exhibition or in a glass case that's supposed to teach us around where we've come from or who we are, that it's all part of that authority of knowledge. So I can't say it any better, but it's a fascinating podcast, I must admit. It's a great one, Mark.
Yeah, it certainly Liz. Liz, this study broadly around phrenology and the looking at the skulls and what that says is something I understand you've had interest in, or the implications of the research. What's your take on it?
So as the panellists have nicely kind of interwoven this discussion, that phrenology and this idea that your skull and the shape and the divots on your skull is related to eugenics and the order of so-called races and this idea that could then justify slavery and so on. We still see these sorts of ideas of eugenics still apparent in the way that we live our lives in modern Australia. Even though our policies have gone out of fashion, the mythology and the beliefs are still embedded in modern society. The way that we view people with disability, the way that we still believe who should go to university or who has the right to a particular level of education based on their socio-economic status or based on the colour of their skin, who has the right to access particular elements of society and so on. All of these things are bound up in this notion of junk science that was bestowed on us based on silly measurements of the skull and the skull divots. We know that this is junk science, and we've known about it for a long time. But these myths have not left our social conscience. We need to move on as a society and not hide away from what has been done. And what has been done, unfortunately, among us and to our brothers and our sisters and to people that we still live with in our community. It's not going to hurt us to own up to these truths. It's not going to mean that we as an individual admit fault, but it means a hell of a lot to move forward, and repatriation is key to that.
I want to get, Mark, your views on repatriation. And it strikes me as I was listening to your podcast and also while I've watched some of your other series is that what you're doing is what we're kind of grappling with as a nation, and that's around truth-telling and how do we have conversations about things that are difficult, that happened potentially a long time, maybe not so long ago, that still have impacts right now, which we've just heard from everyone.
I think the one lesson I've learned from the last couple of years of making things like Stuff the British Stole and House of Skulls is actually that there is an enormous appetite, not just in Australia, but around the world, for the grey areas. Like when I started Stuff the British Stole, it was literally me with a microphone in London. And I really thought I was making this niche show about things in museums that nobody cared about. And what the sort of the audience response from Australia around the world has told me about that and House of Skulls is actually people want more than the nice motherhood statement on the plaque. People want more than the nice thing we say in classrooms. People are aware. People are ready. People want to know that there is good and bad. I think I have an enormous amount of respect for the audience that have come to those shows, because what that tells me is that they're prepared to acknowledge that we have great, wonderful things about our history and we have some really horrific things, and those things never cancel each other out. They don't balance each other out. They simply coexist, and we are actually grown up enough as a nation, I think, to be able to talk about those things. Specifically on repatriation, I mean, with some of those skulls, it's almost impossible to know what to do with them. There is a set of laws in the US where First Nations skulls can be returned. It's expensive, it takes a lot of work, it's way harder than it should be, but at least there's a structure for it. Some of the skulls, I mean, the way he catalogues them is he literally tattoos on their forehead phrases like, I'm going to quote, Negroid Egyptian and lunatic German. Like, that's what he's got there, right? So there's nothing to go with for some of these skulls. So it's, I guess to be fair to the current management of the University of Pennsylvania, it's actually hard to know what to do with some of these skulls and know what is the most ethical and responsible thing to do, which is kind of a microcosm for the history that they're dealing with, which is like, what do you do with this? It's indelibly part of their story. It's indelibly part of the story of science and medicine writ large. Let's start by talking about it. Let's start by acknowledging it and move from there.
Yeah. It's such a powerful point. Thank you so much for your work. And it's great to hear you unpack that as well. Well, the cost of childcare is a burden on many families, and there's new evidence Australians are paying some of the highest costs in the developed world. And on average, Australian families spend 16% of their household income on childcare, almost double the average across OECD countries. That's despite the federal government spending $12.9 billion on parental subsidies this financial year. The research comes from the competition regulator, which in a draft report recommends price caps for the sector. The government has no immediate answers, but says wider reform is necessary.
This is the biggest bill, apart from the mortgage or the rent, that a lot of Australian families pay. We've provided some price relief, but now comes time for some serious reform about what more we can do to keep prices down, put pressure on prices, and at the same time, mate, look at what the big reforms to childcare need to be in the next decade around universal access and affordable access for all children.
Angela Jackson has been a policy advisor to government and is lead economist with Impact Economics and joins us now from Melbourne. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Angela, we've heard some pretty damning statistics from that ACCC report. How did you interpret it?
Look, I think this is what households know. It's what parents certainly know. Anyone using the childcare system over the last 10 or 20 years knows the impost that childcare fees have on the family budget. And we've seen successive governments try and solve it through increasing the rebate, including the current government with a $5.4 billion additional investment. But what the ACCC is really telling us is that it hasn't had much of an impact. And in fact, over time, what we tend to see is that prices rise to match that increase in government support. And so Australian families continue to face very high out-of-pocket childcare costs at around 16% of income, as you've already highlighted. And what the ACCC is saying is, well, wait a minute, what's not working here? What in the market isn't operating effectively? And why, even though the Australian government is providing these additional subsidies, aren't we seeing that fee relief flow through to families? And have a real look at the way in which competition works in this sector. Price is one aspect of it. Quality is obviously another really important aspect of it. And access is also a very important aspect of this market that's failing at the moment, where 35% of us live in a neighbourhood classified as a childcare desert, so can't even get access to care. So there's some real fundamental issues with the way in which we've set this market up, and I think where the ACCC is heading is towards some fundamental changes that will hopefully deliver something that is closely aligned to what our objectives are in childcare, and that is that everybody has access to high quality, affordable care across Australia. The current way we structure this market isn't delivering those outcomes.
And so this report isn't the panacea, is it? Is this really just a step in the journey of looking at what's going on, how that works and how to change it?
It is very much an interim report, but I think what it's heading towards is this idea of, rather than just providing subsidies to households, which is what we currently do. So if you use childcare, you get a subsidy for that, and it's in the hands, if you like, of the consumer. And what we've seen is that tends to drive higher prices. When you try and give the consumer more money, the prices just go up. And so actually what we're paying as parents doesn't really change. Is looking towards more supply side support. So what that means is directly procuring with childcare providers, so with the suppliers, for them to enter the market. So direct subsidies, whether that's block funding or some sort of mix of subsidies to childcare providers. And what that should do, I think, is sort of address some of the market failures that we're seeing at the moment. So both in terms of access, as I said, 35% of us live in areas where we can't even get access, and that's a real problem. So subsidising providers to operate in those areas directly, and also ensuring that we don't see this sort of increase in price every single time the government tries to alleviate some of these pressures.
Yeah, Sally, I want to bring you in. Has the cost of childcare had an impact on you and your family, and I guess you deciding when to go back to work and in what form?
Without a doubt, Dan. So I work for myself, I have my own business. So, I send invoices and wait for people to pay them, and there have been times where it is more expensive for me to send a child to childcare. That is costing more money than I'm getting for work that day. So we have had very little formal childcare for our children because both my husband and I were starting up businesses. The other barrier is the absolute absolute paperwork. And owning your own business and with income changing during the weeks, it means that the subsidy changes all the time. It's consistently changing. So that means consistent paperwork, and that's almost a full-time job in itself. So there are so many barriers. And so for us, I really made the decision that I would just work away when I can. And I know Angela's had the same experience of being in a Zoom when, or being on national TV and having a kid come in the room, because it's the only option to be able to get some work done. I had a Zoom this week and I paid a babysitter so I could do a meeting, and I had the 7-year-olds, because it's school holidays, standing at the door saying, I'm not enjoying this, I'm not enjoying this, while I'm doing a Zoom of my biggest pitch for the year for a client. So we've all had those experiences, but I grew up in a regional town, very proud to come from a town of under 200 people. That is in a region where they have the greatest lack of childcare. So this becomes a real issue, as we know, about equity and access for women's employment when there is simply no childcare options. There are then arguments about what role older family members play and grandparents and neighbours, but we can't rely on that. So many families can't rely on that. And the other thing is as mentioned, as subsidies go up, so do the prices go up, and it creates that economy. But we have to remember too that the majority of childcare providers, like aged care providers, are for-profits, even if they're saying that, you know, even if they belong to a religious or a social welfare group, there is a real profit in childcare. And then there's a debate about wages, and it can go on. It is a broken system, and it's a very difficult fix. So it will be interesting to see what happens with the formal report from the ACCC. Yeah,
Liz, you're nodding away. I wonder if you want to weigh in on that, about perhaps what the solutions are to that comment about it being a broken system, and what the impact of childcare costs have been on you and your family.
Look, I think at one point the most we had in childcare were 3 children, just because of the spacing of our kids, and it didn't last long because we simply couldn't afford it. And that's just the reality. And so, you know, it's ridiculous. And even with support, you're always thinking ahead, kind of whose salary is barely covering the childcare fees this week and so on. But kind of stepping away from that, childcare, we call it childcare, and we kind of have this image that childcare is just wiping noses and bums. And it's not. Childcare, the research clearly shows, is actually early education.
Yes, thank you. That's exactly right.
We do not think about early education in Australia. It has positive outcomes for children. It's lifelong. The early we start, the better the outcomes. It's something we don't tend to factor in Australia. Other countries are miles ahead here. It has good outcomes for the workforce, and it has good outcomes especially for mums, but parents as well. The idea that we're not factoring in early learning and instead are still thinking childcare is noses and bums is silly in my mind.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I also just think it is clear that there are structural issues with the way the industry is set up. It is clear that having an industry that is largely for profit has had knock-on effects. One observation I would make is when we do come to address this, can we please remember that early childhood educators, which is actually what they're called, to your point, Liz.
Yes.
We are, those of us I've got a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old. Both my kids went through childcare, through early childhood education, that's the term. What you are entrusting to these people, and it is worth pointing out, this is an industry overwhelmingly staffed by women as well. What you are entrusting to them is the most precious thing in the world to you. The people that do these jobs are, I think personally, undervalued for the incredible work that they do. I happen to be related to an early childhood educator, which I think is why you can kind of tell I care about it. These people are incredible. The way they change kids' lives, when you have a good, experienced, talented team of early childhood educators, it completely changes the direction of your kids' lives. And whatever happens with this structure in the industry and how we subsidise it, there's clearly issues that need to be addressed. I think it's important to remember that the people actually doing that job, the people actually interacting with your kids, are some of the most important people in the lives of your kids and their future. And I think it's important that that is recognised and valued and probably remunerated better.
And
right?
Yes. You're so right. I've got a sister-in-law that works in the space and works incredibly harder than anyone that I know. Aurora, I want to bring you in because I wonder if what's needed here is a kind of fundamental shift of the way as a society we talk about this, we look at it, and what's the risk to the country if we don't get this right?
Well, I mean, I think, and I'm someone who doesn't have kids on the panel here.
Well, you and I both.
Oh, great. In good company then. But I think I'd reiterate Mark's point about the sort of care work industry or the early childhood education industry to remind us that as we think about these caps on childcare, that we are also thinking about how care workers are some of the most sort of lowly paid people in Australia, and remembering that aspect of it. But I think kind of more structurally, we don't really live in a system that makes sense. You know, previously our economy worked because we had one parent who went to a job and we had one parent home full time who was the carer. And as we've changed this structure, we still have the same sort of expectations on parents to, particularly women, to work full-time jobs, but also do all the care work, to leave meetings to pick kids up, because we haven't changed the school hours. You know, you have school holidays that go for 12 weeks a year when each parent only has 4 weeks annual leave a year. It doesn't add up. So I think structurally, we need to move away from this. I mean, I'm happy if people want to get rid of this 5-day work week, go down to 3, so we've got more time to do whatever we want. I'm super keen on that. It's the worst lie that capitalism told us, that we kept this like long working hours. It's ridiculous. I don't want to work. I want to have free time. So I think, you know, we continue a lie about a structure that's sustainable, and it's not. As you say, many people, and I've heard many friends say, that they're working purely to pay for childcare, but they feel as a woman the desire to stay in the workforce, to continue to progress that career. But we know that your attention isn't necessarily 100% on that, because there's all these other things you have to worry about. So it's this kind of you have to do it all mentality that doesn't actually reflect the world we're living in.
I think, Sally, you wanted to jump in there as well.
I recently read a book about a woman who had 5 children, and she said women of our generation are expected to work like our fathers did, but do the same things that our mothers did. So write the thank you notes, bake the cakes for the lunch boxes, all of those things. So as a society, we still haven't come to terms with any sort of balance shift. I'm lucky I'm in a very equal domestic partnership where we do a lot of the same things. One of our babysitters said the other day, you know, my husband arranges all of our childcare, and she said, oh, my dad would never have known how to do that. So we're still, I'm in a very, I'm not in a fortunate position, I'm in a good partnership. But we are still expected to work like our dads did, do the parenting and caring and loving, nurturing mum stuff, like write the thank you notes for the birthday parties.
Liz, you're nodding away. Did you want to briefly jump in on that before I bring Angela back in?
Sorry, Dan.
Yeah.
No, not at all. This is important.
And this is something that we see in the data, is that we've got lives that are on the ground moving very differently, and social norms changing rapidly because of socio-economic need, but the social structures aren't keeping pace. And so if women want it all, women have to do it all. And it gets to a point of absolute exhaustion. And it's a fatigue that is felt then and infectious to a woman's partner. And so it is a load, an emotional, a physical and a mental load that is all-consuming. And it means that no one gets respite in this equation. Neither in a heterosexual relationship, neither male nor female gets a respite. And whether we like it or not, even in a gay relationship, the equality is not much better. There is still someone that bears the largest brunt of that mental load. It's something that we need more information on to help ease that inequality.
Yeah, and Angela, I want to bring you back in because there's so many different conversations that this brings out. We talked at the start about what was in the report and perhaps where it's going. Do you have a sense from your background, what is the answer, or what are the suite of answers, or the start of the suite of answers here?
Look, I think to start with, reading the report is like music to my ears. As someone who's done a lot of research in sort of the way in which social care markets work and what the imperfections can be, this report fully acknowledges those imperfections, and I think is looking and leading us on a path where we set up the market in a way that can work better for us as a community and for families and individuals, and also providers, which is also, I think, really important. We have basically set up a lot of these markets across aged care, in childcare, in disability care, without really properly accounting for the nature of what we're dealing with in terms of childcare and what's important in that. And so for me, what I take out of my history and studying in this area is it's really good news, I think, overall for families. We probably do need to invest more money. I think, as people have alluded to, wages in this sector do need to increase if we want to have people and the number of people we want to have working in this sector into the future. And so the costs are probably going to go up overall. But let's make sure the way in which we support it and we set this market up is actually working for us in a much better way than it has been. And so, I mean, I don't want to get too excited about an ACCC report. I mean, it pretty much gets nerd alert, but it is.
Go to town, Ed.
I have not read anything coming from the government in a very long time that really captures the way in which this market is impacting, the way in which families make decisions. It talks about the importance of quality, for example, in this market, which is absolutely and utterly, for families making decisions around childcare, quality is such an important driver. And yet the way we've set this market up, it almost ignores it in terms of how that then impacts price. So it is, look, it's a great step forward. And hopefully, when we see the final report, we have, some recommendations about the reforms that can really drive what we all want, which is, access to high quality, affordable childcare across Australia, which we're not currently getting with the current system.
I reckon it'll be music to the ACCC's ears if they reckon that you're getting excited or going to get excited about their report. Just before I let you go, can I ask if you've got a sense of how that conversation then shifts simply from one that is about the cost to one that I'm hearing across the panel, which is about value?
Yeah, look, they're interesting, right? And how you marry those two up. So I guess the real question is around understanding what is the value, obviously, of childcare and understanding that it is, early childhood education and care. I think the panel was right about the language, and sorry for slipping into the old school language there, because this does have real benefits, obviously. And the reason we want that access is, yes, so women can work, and that's one of its great, benefits immediate. But broader than that, we know that access to this early childhood education has huge benefits for child development, particularly for kids from low SES backgrounds. The evidence on that is just indisputable. And then that leads to longer term benefits in terms of health outcomes, in terms of education outcomes, in terms of employment. So the value in this sector is just huge. It is, as Liz said, more than just wiping noses and bums. It is about educating in the most vital years our next generation. And so getting this market right, investing in it is just so critically important. And that's why it is exciting. I mean, I think this report is exciting, as geeky as that might be.
That's brilliant. Angela Jackson is lead economist with Impact Economics. Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, finally tonight, to many women and some men, makeup is a daily armour. But is ditching it an act of rebellion? That's the question Baywatch legend Pamela Anderson has inspired this week with her barefaced appearance at Paris Fashion Week. The former glamour model and 90s TV icon says she began paring down her cosmetics in 2019 after the death of her makeup artist and close friend. Her new makeup-free move was celebrated this week by fellow actress Jamie Lee Curtis.
This woman showed up and claimed her seat at the table with nothing on her face. I am so impressed and floored by this act of courage and rebellion.
Liz, we've known each other a long time. I feel like I can say this to you. I'm really conflicted about this report. On one hand, is this actually something that's really important? Or should we be shocked that we are having a conversation about someone deciding not to wear makeup?
First of all, I love Pammy, right? Love Pammy. I just
Full
want
disclosure
to
up
be
front.
really clear. I just want to be really clear, all right? Second of all, we would not be having this conversation if it was a fella,
No,
all right?
no.
Yeah,
All right, let's
absolutely.
be clear.
That's my point.
Yeah, right? Next of all, you could probably see by my face that I'm not a makeup wearer, right? And in fact, I had to take pointers years ago from an ABC journal about what makeup should one wear if they're doing a 7:30 report. And I was told to throw a bit of powder on my face. And I got advice on where to go to get powder and so on. That's literally, okay, we won't go into that. Funny story for another time. But,
God, I hope that wasn't from me.
It wasn't from you, but the poor journo was so horrified. It was, just get some powder, Liz. Just put it on the forehead.
And you're like, what does that mean?
That's exactly, what powder? And what do I do with it? Anyway, I didn't take the advice. So back to the story and Pammy, who I adore. Pammy says she's not wearing makeup, but Pammy's had work done, right? And Pammy has privilege. So when Pammy comes out makeup free, Pammy's had lamination or something tinting on her eyebrows and the lashes. Her hair is not natural. Pammy's had something done to her face, and let's not even talk on like the torso. So she's natural, but with alterations. So celebration, yes, but also I think we're deluding ourselves that this is not natural. Does that make sense?
I think Mark wants to weigh in. We'll have to keep it brief because we're crunching time.
I think the thing that I find, I guess, kind of impressive about this is it's about agency. With Pamela Anderson in particular, you're talking about a woman who's had her image kind of violently taken away from her across her career, and she's been looked down on. And yes, she's profited from it to some degree as well. But you know, what I like about this is it's not about whether she's wearing makeup or not wearing makeup, or whether she's had work or not had work. She has agency. She can rock up and do what she wants. And I think, regardless of the mechanics of exactly what she is or isn't wearing, I respect and admire that for a woman who's had a lot taken away from her in her image early on in her career.
Aurora, what do you make of it?
Well, for a start, I would say that I got the time wrong for this because I forgot to factor in daylight savings, as all West Australians do. And I was rushing to get here, and I was like, I'm still going to put on a bit of makeup in the car. I'm in the car park before I get on. So even though I'd like to sort of move away from the classics of the beauty standards, I find myself trapped by them in some ways, although perhaps less than other people. Look, is it the most courageous thing I've seen a person do? No, there are amazing activists out there doing wonderful things. I think Mark does have a point in that Pamela Anderson has always been sort of objectified from this angle, and that as you sort of get ageing, there are these questions about your validity and relevance anymore, if that's purely how you've been seen. But at another level, she is one of the most beautiful women in the world. And she's allowed to not wear makeup and still look great. And there's other people, I guess, who don't have that privilege and ability to do that as well and pass and be acceptable in society, because we know all the biases that go along with it. But I guess at the same time, we also know that if people with power and influence in these spaces set different tones, it can help create a different expectation and culturally as well. So a bit, it's okay, but is it the most amazing thing I've heard? No.
Sally, we'll have to come back to you on this next time. I'm very keen to hear what you have to say about it, though. But that is all we've got time for tonight. Thank you to our panel, Mark Fennell, Liz Allen, Sally Branson and Aurora MILROY. Do have an excellent evening. Casey Briggs is going to be back with you tomorrow night. For now, though, good night.